Put that red sheet down, Mateo. The glass cutter is for storefront panes, not little saints in halos. The words snapped through the shop while the smell of metal dust and window putty still hung in the air. Morning light came in pale through stacked clear panels, and on the back table, half covered with a cloth, a piece of colored glass glowed like a coal. Mateo kept his hand on it anyway. "I'll finish the order," he said. "Just let me solder this line first." Lorena didn't even look at the glowing panel. She looked at the invoices clipped by the register. In that family, glass meant straight edges, fast hands, and clean measurements. Clear panes for doors, restaurants, storefronts, work people paid for without asking questions. Lorena had built her life on that kind of certainty. She trusted what could be loaded, delivered, and billed before sunset. Mateo, though, kept losing himself in lead came, tiny cuts of color, and church window sketches no customer had ordered. His older brother Daniel made things worse without trying very hard. "I finished 3 shop fronts this week," he said, lifting a crate like proof. "That's the kind of work that lasts." Mateo said nothing. He was used to that comparison by now. One son with steady contracts. One son with strange pieces of blue and ruby glass hidden in the corner. Only his grandfather Rafael noticed the way Mateo touched those scraps, like they were alive. And that same evening, when the shop finally went quiet, Rafael opened an old wooden box and said, "If you're serious, take these before your mother sees them." If this story pulls you in, subscribe and stay with me, because that box changed everything. Inside Rafael's box, the tools were heavier than Mateo expected. Just old, worn metal with dark wooden handles, smoothed by years of use. A lead knife, a fid, a pair of grozing pliers, and a little hand grinder wrapped in yellowed cloth. When Mateo lifted them, his fingers came away smelling faintly of oil and old dust. Rafael watched him the whole time, quiet as ever. "Your great-grandfather used those on chapel repairs," he said, "back when people still believed a window could say something." Mateo didn't answer right away. He was looking at the thin nicks in the handles, the kind left by work done over decades. Rafael showed him how to hold the cutter with less force, how to listen for the right scratch on the surface before the break. "Don't bully the glass," he murmured. "Guide it." Then he unfolded a scrap of pattern paper and pointed to the curve of a wing, the fold of a robe, the border of a small roundel, structure, balance, light. For a few evenings after that, Mateo worked in the corner after the shop went still. Clear panes leaned in their racks like silent judges. He cut his daytime orders first, swept the floor, locked the front, and only then went back to the colored pieces. Sometimes Lorena noticed the lamp still on and said nothing. Sometimes Daniel smirked and tapped a fresh invoice against the counter. "This one's real work," he'd say. Then one night, Lorena walked in sooner than he expected, saw the glowing panel laid out under the lamp, and saw exactly how far he'd gone. From that night on, Lorena stopped pretending the back corner was harmless. She stood over the work table with her arms folded, the lamp throwing sharp shadows across the half-built panel. Bits of red, amber, and deep blue lay sorted in careful rows. The soldering iron still smelled hot. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. Mateo wiped his hands on a rag, buying himself a second. "After hours," he said, "when the orders are done." Lorena's face tightened, not because he had lied exactly, but because she could see how much of him had gone into something the shop had never asked for. Daniel came in at the worst moment, carrying a clipboard and talking about a new storefront job. Then he saw the table and gave a short laugh through his nose. "So that's where the missing evenings go." He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The comparison was already sitting there between them, plain as cut glass. One son bringing in contracts, the other bending over colored pieces no one had commissioned. Rafael tried to soften it. He picked up one section and turned it toward the light. "He's learning fast," he said quietly. "There's a hand for this." But Lorena was past hearing praise. She touched the edge of the workbench, then the order slips near the register, as if reminding herself which world kept the lights on. "A hand for it doesn't mean a future in it," she said. Mateo wanted to answer, but the truth caught in his throat. Because the panel on that table was no longer a small experiment, and Lorena had just realized it too. After that, the shop felt smaller to Mateo. The back corner was still there, the same scarred table, the same hanging lamp, but now every hour he spent there felt counted. Lorena never forbade him outright, just gave him more to do. Larger panes to trim, deliveries to wrap, shelves to sort. By the time the front door was locked, his shoulders ached and his fingertips were raw from handling clear sheet glass all day. Still, he kept going. At night, he worked on the panel in silence, fitting each piece into place, bending the strips around the curves, checking the lines Rafael had taught him to respect. Some parts fought him. One blue section cracked with a dry little snap, and he had to start it again. Another looked perfect on the table and lifeless in the light. That was the part nobody in the family seemed to understand. The work wasn't only cutting, it was waiting, adjusting, seeing what changed when the color finally met the sun. One rainy afternoon, a woman came into the shop carrying a small wooden frame wrapped in a towel. The border glass inside it was old, amber with a fine branch-like crack running through one corner. She said it came from a little chapel nearby and asked, almost apologetically, whether anyone still repaired this kind of thing. Mateo took one look and knew it wasn't ordinary. He was about to answer when Lorena stepped forward first, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "No, ma'am, we don't do that work anymore." But the woman turned to Mateo anyway, as if she had noticed something in his face. That look stayed with him long after the woman left. Lorena had turned her away, but Mateo could still see the cracked amber border in that towel and the careful way the woman held it against her chest. It wasn't the kind of glass people tossed aside. It had age in it, that soft waviness old panes carry when the light moves through them like water. All afternoon, while he scored clear sheets for a hardware order, his mind stayed on that chapel frame. So when the shop closed, he did something small and defiant. He asked Rafael where the chapel was. The old man glanced at him over his glasses, then named the place without a lecture. Mateo went the next morning before work. The building sat back from the road, quiet, with rain-dark stone and a wooden door worn pale around the handle. Inside, the air smelled like wax, damp wood, and old dust. The border panel was still there, high along the side, and even from below, he could tell the crack was only the beginning. The painted lines were fading. The lead joints had started to bow. The whole thing was asking for someone who knew how to listen before touching. He stood there longer than he meant to. For the first time, the craft in his hands felt larger than proving a point at home. This wasn't about making something pretty just because he loved color. It was about keeping light, memory, and work from another pair of hands from being replaced by something flat and easy. When Mateo got back to the shop, Lorena was waiting by the cleared counter, and on the table beside her lay his sketchbook. The sketchbook was open to the page he never meant Lorena to see. Not the rough practice cuts or the little border studies. The real one. A full panel drawn in pencil and color notes, with robes, hands, folds of light, and tiny marks where the lead lines would carry the weight. Mateo felt the back of his neck go hot. Lorena didn't raise her voice at first, which made it worse. She turned one page, then another, and the thin paper whispered under her fingers. "How much shop time went into this?" she asked. Mateo said, "My own time." Daniel, standing by the counter, gave a tired kind of laugh. "Your own time? In our space? With our materials?" He wasn't cruel for the pleasure of it. That was the sharp part. To him, this was plain math. Glass used, lead used, hours lost, orders delayed. He tapped the edge of the sketchbook and said, "Mom, I'm landing accounts while he's designing church pictures." Rafael stepped in then, quiet but steady. He said the work had value, that old methods disappear when nobody bothers to learn them. Lorena looked at him, then at Mateo, and something in her face hardened into fear more than anger. "Value to who?" she asked. "To people who admire it for a minute? We run a business here. I cannot build this family on maybe." The room went still. Mateo could hear the hum of the cooler in the back, the faint rattle of rain at the front glass, his own breathing. Then Lorena said the words that changed the air in the whole shop. "In this family, you choose now, the trade that feeds you or this." Nobody answered Lorena right away. The rain kept ticking against the front windows, and somewhere in the back, a loose metal strip gave a faint little rattle every time the wind pushed the building. Mateo looked at the sketchbook, then at the half-finished panel in the corner. He knew what she was asking him to give up. Not a pastime. The thing that had started to feel most like his own hands. "I can do both," he said at last. "I can finish the shop work and build this after hours." Daniel let out a breath and shook his head. "That's what you've been saying." He was certain now. "Orders are piling up, Mom's carrying the risk, and you're still chasing something nobody around here is paying for." Lorena stepped closer. Her voice stayed low, which made every word land harder. "Then hear me clearly. By the end of the week, that corner is cleared. No more shop materials. No more time taken from this business. If you want to work here, you work here. Fully." Rafael opened his mouth, but she stopped him with one look. Not disrespect, desperation. The kind that comes from years of holding a family together by keeping every invoice paid and every mistake small. Mateo said nothing after that. He just went to the back table later, ran his thumb over the cool edge of the colored panel, and stood there in the dim light for a long time. When he came in 3 mornings later, the corner was empty, and in the scrap bin beside the bench, he saw strips of bent lead and one broken piece of ruby glass. For a second, Mateo did not move. The shop smelled like wet cardboard, metal shavings, and fresh coffee gone cold on the counter. His corner was bare. The lamp was still there, hanging over an empty table as if nothing had happened. In the scrap bin, tangled among offcuts and bent strips, he saw pieces he knew by touch before he picked them up. A curve from the robe, part of a border, the ruby shard, sharp as a little tooth in his palm. Lorena came from the office and stopped a few feet away. She looked tired, not triumphant. "The lead was reusable," she said. "I told you what would happen." Mateo kept staring at the broken glass. Daniel stayed near the front, pretending to sort papers, but he was listening to every breath in the room. Rafael was the only one who stepped closer, and when he saw the bin, his face changed. Mateo didn't yell. That was what made it so hard to hear him. He only asked, "You melted it down?" Lorena answered with the same practical tone she used for damaged inventory. "I cleared the space. We have orders to fill." Something in him went quiet right there. He took the ruby piece, wrapped Raphael's tools in an old cloth, and put them in a canvas bag. Raphael followed him to the door and pressed a thin notebook into his hand. Measurements, sketches, firing notes, years of old work. "Don't build your life out of anger," the old man said softly. "Build it out of skill." By nightfall, Mateo had found a narrow room over a repair shop, and before the week was over, the storm hit, hard enough to rattle every pane in town. By morning, the whole town was talking about broken glass. The storm had come through in the dark, with that low, rolling sound that makes windows hum before they shake. Mateo heard it from his narrow room upstairs, where the roof clicked and settled with every gust. At first light, he stepped outside and saw glitter in the gutters, cracked panes along the block, and people already pointing their phones toward the hill. The church had taken the worst of it. A section of the great rose window had blown out, not cleanly, but in jagged wounds. Some pieces still clung to the stone tracery, others had fallen inward. Rain had streaked the floor below with colored dust and tiny shards. Mateo stood behind the rope line with everyone else, cold air in his lungs, and stared. Most people saw damage. He saw something else, too. The surviving pieces told him how the lost ones had been made. The glass wasn't flat and even. It carried depth. Thin stain in one area, denser shadow in another. Edges that shifted from red to ember when the light caught them. Old work. Patient work. The kind that could not be faked with a quick replacement and a sales pitch. Two men in hard hats were already talking numbers near the entrance. Mateo heard one of them say, "Temporary clear panels first, decorative match later, maybe." That word hit him harder than it should have. Decorative. He moved closer than he meant to. And when one of the church staff said they needed someone who understood historic glass, Mateo heard his own voice answer before he had time to second guess it. The words were out before Mateo could pull them back. A woman in a dark coat turned toward him first. She had a clipboard under one arm, rain still shining on the shoulders of her jacket. "You understand historic glass?" she asked. Her tone wasn't rude, but it had that careful edge people use when they think they're being polite to someone unproven. Mateo swallowed. "Some of it," he said. "Enough to know this can't be patched with clear panels and called finished." That got the attention of the man in the hard hat. He looked Mateo up and down, taking in the work boots, the dust on his cuffs, the fact that he was standing outside the rope like everyone else. "And who are you?" he asked. Before Mateo could answer, another voice came from behind. Daniel. He had come up the hill with a delivery truck and stopped when he saw the crowd. "He's my brother," he said. Not kindly, not cruelly either, just flat. "He works with glass. Sort of." That "sort of" stung more than Mateo wanted to show. The woman with the clipboard introduced herself as Evelyn Hart, the church's restoration coordinator. She listened while Mateo pointed, not touching anything, just looking. The surviving pieces, he said, showed hand shading, uneven color depth, old cuts that modern stock wouldn't match. If they replaced it with smooth new glass, the window would lose its age in one afternoon. Evelyn studied him for a long second. Then she said, "If you believe that, prove it. Bring me one sample panel by Friday, and make me trust your hands." Friday suddenly felt too close to breathe in. Back in his rented room, Mateo set Rafael's notebook on the table and spread out every scrap of colored glass he owned. It wasn't much. A few deep reds, some uneven amber, one smoky blue, and smaller pieces that only made sense if he was careful enough not to waste a corner. The room smelled of damp plaster, solder, and the bitter coffee he kept forgetting to drink. Outside, cars hissed through leftover rain. He worked with the notebook open, not copying it, but listening to it. Old measurements, tiny sketches, notes about heat, line weight, and how painted shadow should never choke the light beneath it. He ground an edge too far on the first piece and had to start over. On the second try, his hand steadied. Then he mixed a little grisaille paint, thin at first, then deeper, testing the way it gathered along the brush marks. What he was making wasn't flashy. That was the point. It had to feel old without pretending to be ancient. Rafael came by late that evening, climbing the stairs slowly. He stood over the table for a long minute and said only, "You're finally not trying to impress the glass." To Mateo, that sounded almost like a blessing. The harder part came the next morning. At the church office, Evelyn met him with the same guarded face, while Daniel unloaded a crate nearby and avoided his eyes. Several committee members had gathered too, dressed for caution, not trust. And when Mateo unwrapped the sample panel, nobody spoke at first. What changed the room was not the color at first, it was the light. Evelyn took the sample from Mateo's hands and, instead of studying it under the office lamps, carried it toward the tall side window. Morning light came through thin and gray after the storm, but even that was enough. The little panel woke up in her hands. The painted shadow held. The red didn't shout. The line work sat where it should, quiet and sure. One of the committee members leaned closer. Another stopped pretending to check papers. The man in the hard hat frowned, then said, "Could have been bought somewhere." Mateo answered before fear could catch him. He pointed out the cut marks, the thickness shifts, the way the painted surface softened into the glass, instead of sitting on top like a decal. Then he named what had to happen next if they truly meant to save the rose window, instead of replacing its memory with something neat and dead. Evelyn listened all the way through. Daniel did too. He stood off to one side with his jaw tight, hearing his younger brother speak in a voice he had never once used in the family shop. Certain. By noon, Mateo had permission to document the damaged sections and build a restoration proposal. Just the narrow opening he had asked life for. He worked like a man trying to keep a door from closing. And 3 nights later, with sketches spread across his table and salvaged pieces tagged in order, the kiln temperature jumped too high, and one whole painted section began to cloud before his eyes. Mateo saw the clouding happen like breath on a mirror. 1 second, the painted section looked steady inside the kiln glow, and the next, the surface turned dull in a way he knew was wrong. His stomach dropped. He opened the chamber as soon as he safely could, heat washing hard across his face, and lifted the piece out with shaking hands. Under the lamp, the damage was clear. The shading had gone muddy. Not ruined beyond repair, maybe, but not worthy of that window. He could have hidden it. That was the temptation. Keep moving, meet the date, let nobody know how close the work had come to slipping. But the whole point of this craft, the thing Rafael had tried to put into his hands along with those tools, was honesty. With people, with the glass itself. So Mateo called Evelyn that same night. He told her exactly what happened. No excuses, no dramatic speech, just the truth. That several painted sections had to be remade if the restoration was going to deserve the church. There was a long silence on the line. Then Evelyn let out a slow breath and said, "I'm angry, but I'd be angrier if you'd installed work you didn't believe in." That one sentence held the whole night together. By the next afternoon, he was back at the table, recutting, repainting, firing again. Rafael sat nearby with a blanket over his knees, too tired to stand long, but still sharp enough to catch the small mistakes. And at the family shop across town, Lorena heard someone say Mateo was delaying the whole rededication. She surprised herself by answering, "Then it must need doing." 2 mornings later, before sunrise, the final sections were carried up the scaffold, and from the church floor below, Lorena stepped quietly through the back doors. When the covering finally dropped, the church went still. Morning light poured through the restored rose window and spread across the stone in deep red, gold, and blue. Faces lifted without anyone meaning to. The color moved over old pews, over damp eyes, over Evelyn standing with her hands clasped tight in front of her. Mateo stayed near the scaffold at first, exhausted, shoulders aching, shirt marked with dust and smoke from long nights of firing and soldering. He looked less like a miracle and more like what he had always been, A man who had worked until the work could speak for itself. Lorena stood halfway down the aisle, neither in front nor hidden. When Mateo walked toward her, Daniel stepped back, and Rafael, from the pew, watched without moving. Mateo opened his hand. In his palm lay that saved shard of ruby glass from the panel that had been broken apart in the shop. He placed it in Lorena's fingers without a word. She lifted it toward the new light. The red crossed her face like a wound, then like warmth. Her mouth trembled before any tears came. "I thought usefulness had to look plain," she whispered. Mateo nodded once. He did not need more than that. Some things are only understood when light passes through what was almost thrown away. Afterward, when the church had emptied, the colored glow still rested on the floor, and Raphael sat smiling to himself as if he were listening to an old friend. If this one stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe for more stories told one quiet step at a time.